is January 1923, and the Bolsheviks are now mopping up the last few pockets of resistance after a brutal Russian civil war. They hold complete power in the urban and industrial centers, and with tremendous sums of interest-free loans coming from the London and New York banking houses, they begin consolidating their acquisition with armaments manufacturing and a rapid buildup of political infrastructure. Certain ethnic blocs are singled out for immediate liquidation. Some must wait for their demise in the coming years, while others still, who fall in between, are relocated thousands of miles from their homes, never to see them again. One group in particular, the last of the old Christian holdouts, who refused to follow the state-run orthodoxy of the Patriarch Nikon in 1652, had removed themselves into the dark, secluded forests of the Russian north. They were called the Old Believers, and for 250 years they lived in these vast, remote hinterlands, forgotten by time and history, until the spring of 1923, when machines on wheels, driven by Soviet commissars and Red Army soldiers, entered those unremembered places to begin the greatest genocide in human history. In the lead-up to these events, the Bolshevik regime had made the persecution of religious groups, particularly Russian Orthodox Christians, and the utter destruction of their houses of worship, a priority. This was part of a program under which Lenin demanded the extirpation of all religious and cultural idealism, or what he called militant atheism. Initially, coercive public education and propaganda were tried under the auspices of the VertigoPolitix, or Ministry of Enlightenment. But by 1923, the desired results were simply not being realized, and over the next 5 years, a series of legislative decrees created a system of gulags and industrial killing sectors designed to hold political and religious convicts before their transfer back east or outright execution. Strangely, in stark contrast to these maneuvers, and which must be noted, by the mid-1920s, the Bolsheviks had made peaceful alliances with numerous Islamic delegations in return for their loyalty in the fight against anti-communist factions still operating in the Asiatic regions of the Soviet Union. As a result, most mosques and places of Muslim worship were left intact, except in those rural outliers where local insurrectionists sided with pro-Islamic elements of the Basmaki rebellion. Although all religious places of worship were nationalized by decree in 1919, many synagogues and the Jewish communities attached to them remained relatively autonomous, primarily due to the fact that this ethno-religious group habitated almost exclusively in urban centers, where their cooperation was urgently needed during the period of Soviet consolidation. This goodwill, however, all changed a decade later, during the Stalinist purges, when the Semitic elements within the Soviet power hierarchy were systematically hunted down and removed from positions of influence. When the massacres were finally over, 120,000 Russian Orthodox priests were shot to death. 30,000 of the world's most beautiful churches were razed to the ground. 200,000 religious icons and ancient Christian artifacts were destroyed or melted down for their gold, and some 25 million Christians were murdered for their faith, many of whom were either buried alive in family groups or burned en masse within their own churches. In the 2 decades from the outset of the Russian Civil War until the German liberation of the Ukraine in 1941, the Bolshevik and Stalinist regimes would exterminate over 60 million souls, either by direct execution or deliberately created famine. The Old Believers, or Shtorobryadtsi, after the Great Schism of the 1650s, relocated their communities away from the urban centers into the North Country and Siberia. Originally, they were almost entirely comprised of ethnic Rus, a group of people having both Varangian and Slavic bloodlines. Their form of Eastern Orthodox Christianity was likely the earliest in Slavic Europe, having a known history from the 8th century, after the Second Council of Nicaea allowed the veneration of icons, which became a hallmark of the Eastern Church and the inspiration for its artistic achievements. Its adherents did not smoke or drink. The men wore their beards long. The women dressed modestly, with scarves about their heads. Their folklore was simple and wise, a mixture of old Russian legends, pagan myths, and early Byzantine allegories. Old Believers elected their priests, often called preceptors, a custom for which they broke from the politicized control of the Patriarch Nikon in 1652. but it was the tradition of their old Slavonic language and its usage as a defying token against the state, which gave them immunity to modern concepts and cultural subversion. This made them factionally anathema, and therefore the enemies of communism. In the early stages of the Civil War, atrocities began to occur in the less remote communities. Many old believers took this as a sign and fled Russia into the Baltic, Poland, the Ukraine, Moldavia, and even as far away as Romania. By 1923, however, the routes along Russia's borders were strictly guarded by the Red Army, and the free movement of persecuted peoples was checked. It was at this point that Lenin had had enough, and Stalin, as Commissar for Ethnic Minorities, was tasked with coordinating the Checha's intelligence division with Red Army delegates for the expulsion of old believers in the regions to the north and east of Petrograd and Moscow, an area covering some 2 million square miles. But because no logistical plans were made for the actual relocation of these people, the outcome to such an immense enterprise could only be murder. The lorries, full of ex-convicts, freshly released from the most notorious prisons in Russia, made their way north in late April 1923. None of the men in this vanguard had ever witnessed pristine lakelands or deep pine forests before. Their brief indoctrination seminars had told them that this region was full of untapped potential, only requiring the disposal of its inhabitants, and that these people were enemies of the state, the newly made state which had given these prisoners their freedom. So, as soon as the first Old Believer villages were encountered, mass rape and butchery immediately ensued. Furthermore, Lenin expressly forbade Trotsky or any others of Jewish descent within the Soviet command structure to play a visible part in the anti-church campaign. This order had been given after the violence made towards Jewish commissars in the Ukraine a year prior, where, during the early stages of a famine, while grain and livestock were being sequestered, the starving Ukrainians beat dozens of Jewish officers to death. On paper, the instruction made sense, as many of the Old Believers considered the Bolsheviks as a plague brought upon Russia by an act of God, and that Jews were the chosen dispensers of this affliction. However, due to their substantial representation among the officer cadres and commissariat, hundreds of Jews were compelled to take part in the campaign, and the antipathy this would create in the dialogue between church elders and these representatives of the Russian Soviet made certain that talks promptly broke down. The first villages to be razed were in the state of Archangel, particularly around Nizhnaya Toima, where tens of thousands of Old Believers had resettled, many of whom having refused the offer of conversion in the 19th century. When approached by commissars inquiring about the village, church preceptors, or simply asking for their names, the women would merely turn their backs on the interrogators, while some of the men would step forward and say, "I am Christ." This often infuriated the political examiners, which initially led to savage beatings, but quickly escalated into church burnings and savagery. News quickly spread across the Russian north that a Red Death was rising out of the south, but many Old Believers, having nowhere else to go, remained steadfast, convinced that prayers and faith would protect them. Because communists were considered demonic, church elders and local men would stand on the outskirts of a village, making the sign of the cross, attempting to ward off the evil as it approached. But this act only incensed the more godless among the Bolshevik ranks, and in thousands of cases, the right arms of adult males were hacked off, as a warning to others, never to raise the sign of Christ before a commissar again. This process continued unabated until 1935, and when the spilled blood had long soaked into the earth, some 10 million Old Believers had been slaughtered. The unhappy few who managed to survive, perhaps 100,000 souls, left their ruined, old-world churches behind, and moved their small communities deeper into the hinterlands, losing all touch with modern humanity. Over the past few decades, a renaissance of the old belief has occurred throughout Russia that has spurred on feelings for rural living, a sense of spiritual direction, and burgeoning national pride. And the historical context of these convictions cannot be overstated, for much of the distrust experienced by Russians today towards the socialist, liberal, and globalist policies of Western states is the result of their history, and therefore a part of their national character. Despite the ceaseless, asymmetrical culture war being waged against them by the Western deep states and their satellite organizations, they will never again submit to interference in their social and political affairs. in which a purely Russian moral constitution now resides. And in lieu of these facts, for those of us in the dissident right, Russia and her people, despite their many faults, cannot be overlooked, nor should they, with so many convictions in line with ours, be cast out of mind, when they are, more than any other group, our natural allies.